we're good to go. All right. Well, thank you for having this conversation. I'm so excited to meet you, even if it's just virtually.
Yep, me too. Very excited to meet you too, Amanda.
Awesome. Could you tell me maybe more about yourself and why you wanted to run for Senate, and how you think, like, how you think the Senate is? It's very different. I actually just would be curious from my own perspective, being in the House. I love to hear what people think from the outside, what they think the Senate and the House are actually like. So if you want to tell me that, that'd be cool. And how, I know you have a little baby, so I'd love to hear how you're going to balance work life, because the Senate's tough. And you know, what are your goals for when you get into the Senate? What do you want to do?
Yeah, absolutely. So thanks for the question. So a little bit about myself. I am from Stratham originally, so I'm a homegrown New Hampshireite, and my family had the Dairy Queen in Exeter, which you may or may not have ever been to. We actually lived above it when I was really little, when my parents were just starting it. So I worked there my whole life, and I've worked in food service and other places too, which I think, you know, teaches one a good work ethic and, you know, how to work hard for things that they need. Also sort of starts to play into the balance question that you asked about. I then, you know, I went to Phillips Exeter on scholarship. I went to Dartmouth on scholarship. I got kind of a travel bug, and I joined the Peace Corps out of college. And, you know, really there started to express what I feel like is sort of a lifelong commitment to service and being able to help other people. If I'm lucky, which I consider myself to be, you know, then I just want to make sure I'm helping those around me as well to the extent that I can. After that, I came home. I was here in the area briefly, waitressing actually, and then I went off to law school at Cornell, which was about as similar to New Hampshire as I could find for a law school. And then I did a couple of years in New York and DC, but I always knew I wanted to come back. And so I came back, met my wife, got married, and have been working here since. I am now general counsel of a solar company. So I've been a practicing lawyer for about 10 years, and I do transactional and corporate law. So I help finance projects, I buy and sell solar projects, I help write our leases, you know, record deeds, do all that kind of work day in and day out. And so I'm used to the importance of details and the paperwork and reading through a lot of material and making sure that you're digesting what's important and getting to all the details. So, you know, a lot of the questions you asked me are all interrelated, but, you know, I'm motivated to serve in the Senate by a sense of duty, like I was talking about. I think that this is an exceptional time for the state, and I think my background in small business and my motivation to make sure that we're lifting each other up in our community, and we're including those that are less fortunate than we are, and that we're thinking and making policy with compassion, I think is really important in this time. And so that often comes down to small details on pieces of paper, and I think it's important to make sure that we're sort of seeing the big picture, but also getting the little details right. And I think that's a skill set that I have to bring. I have a deep history on workforce housing. That's actually how I got involved in electoral politics. I started off on the board of the Workforce Housing Coalition. Actually, before that, I did a little work while I was in law school. I reached out in New Hampshire to see what sort of co-op or intern projects I could find here that would help with attracting and retaining young professionals. And so I got involved in zoning and, you know, read about 30 zoning ordinances just to start to understand what changes would allow housing that was more affordable and would allow young people to stay here. And so that's been an issue I've been involved in my entire legal career. And it was how I ended up on city council, because that's where you pass the zoning ordinance, which of course you know. And so that was a place where I could make change and did. You know, my first 2 years in office as a city councilor, I ran a very comprehensive community conversation where I asked the mayor to form a housing committee. I chaired that committee. We looked across the entire city to figure out where housing would best fit in with our existing neighborhoods and our existing spaces. And then And then we analyzed what type of zoning was appropriate for those areas. And then, we ran a Portsmouth Listens dialogue. We did a workshop with local architects. We had a lot of community conversation. And so ultimately, we're successful in passing those zoning changes in our second to last meeting of our first term with virtually no opposition. So that was a really great process to sort of demonstrate my model of government and how I think that it's important to be focused on making change, but also to make sure you're having a conversation and you're listening and you're incorporating feedback. So and then, lastly, I guess I'd say, having worked in the renewables industry for 5 or 6 years now, I'm really aware of what policies are working in different states. And so being able to bring some of those programs, like Maine just recently essentially copied what Massachusetts does, and they saw really big transformation in their renewables market in Maine. And so being able to learn from other states' experience. I know, we don't always want to be like Massachusetts, but there are some things we can learn from other states. And I think, we can use those to see a more green future in New Hampshire if we put our minds to it. So those are some of the skills and background and motivations that brought me into this race.
Very cool. Yeah. Okay. So I have been trying to figure out, since we at least started talking a couple of weeks ago, I know you, but I can't figure out why I know you, how I know you. Do you work for Revision? Who's the organization, the solar organization?
My company's called Sunrays Investments, but we know Revision, actually. We, contract.
I'm sorry. I'm just trying to figure out, when you know somebody, but you can't figure out where you know them from. That's what I'm trying to go through right now. I'm like, because our history seemed to have crossed. I mean, my background's hospitality as well, and energy is obviously really important in the environment. And I'm just like, we must have at some point. But I'm racking my brain, so I apologize.
We'll figure it out.
We've got time. Yes, I'm sure we'll figure it out. So, what made you want to run for Senate? Was it just like the next logical step after city council, or was there a request, or just besides the civic duty, which of course I love, because I think we all who serve have that.
Sure.
What drew you to this? Because it's a big role.
Yes, it is a big role, and I take that seriously. For me, I think that one of the skill sets I can bring to the state is as a legislator. As a city councilor, you also are in many ways a legislator. And so what appeals to me specifically about this office is the ability to help craft solutions. I think often we talk at a high level about ideas, and with your experience that, what ultimately matters is what gets put down on the piece of paper. And so I think being able to look through the RSAs and figure out what words need to be changed and put those into a bill. I mean, that is the skill set, and that's something as a lawyer I've done. It's something as a housing advocate I've done. And I think that being able to have a skill set not only for communicating and understanding the policy, but also to make sure you're a steward of that process, and that you can be a champion on certain issues with knowledge it's important as a senator. I think it would allow you to really make an impact on the issues that matter to your constituency. And so I wouldn't call it the next logical step, but I have gotten pulled into housing work at the state level. And so, as that experience has continued to grow, it sort of did feel like a role that I could fulfill, with seriousness and with competence. But of course, there's always lots that the Senate needs to cooperate with many bodies on, of course, including all the reps in the House and the district. So, I think it's a critical role for the state. And I think now more than ever, we just need to make sure we have people that are in government that are motivated by the right things and that are really compassionate, and making sure we look at the data when we make decisions. And so, if not you, who, I think when you feel that that's important to do, then it's important to step up and do it. So.
That's great. As you've been doing these conversations, what has come up as the major issues that people are concerned about?
Yeah, small business has been a big one, and just how I think two themes there for me. One has been, sort of how the aid that has unrolled so far has worked? You know, are there pressure points in that, and have they sort of successfully supported businesses? And I think for the most part, I've heard that initially, you know, the ratio of 75-25, you know, for rent and utilities and payroll was a tough ratio, but the 60-40 seems to be something that people are better able to accommodate. And then I think the longer timeline in terms of being able to expend the funds that they got has been important to businesses too, that I'm hearing. And so not everyone was able to avoid total layoffs, but the majority that I've talked to actually were able to avoid most. And I'd be curious actually to hear your feedback on this too. And then I would say just the other pressure point I've heard about is adaptability. And I think it's an area where, again, we need to make sure we're speaking and supporting from a policy perspective with compassion there. But I do think there's been some amazing stories of businesses turning on a dime, you know, and kind of developing new business models from scratch in an instant because they had to, and because, you know, the people that work for them depend on them. And so those are great stories, and I think we need to celebrate them. And then I think we also need to make sure that the businesses that are, you know, maybe through no fault of their own or otherwise, just if they're having a little trouble doing that, or if their industry doesn't necessarily make that easy, then, you know, making sure they have access to the myriad of free tools that are out there, you know, such as SCORE and, you know, SBDC and other sort of community supports that are there to help make them through that transition.
So this is, I guess, probably a little personal to me. My relation with Senator Fuller Clark is very much based on the environment. She being the chair of that particular committee in the Senate, and me being the chair in the House. We talk often about environmental issues, and I'm curious because it does affect Portsmouth and a lot of the areas around that you are campaigning is the Coakley landfill.
Sure.
And water pollution in general. I'm assuming because being on the city council, you're familiar with all the legal stuff that has gone on with the Coakley group. How would you, and she's always fighting, and there's always a bill every year that seems to come out of her committee that deals with some issue that has to do with Coakley. Would you continue that? Would you take a different stance on it? I'm just curious on a personal level, what you would fight for on a state level that you might not be able to get on a local level.
Sure. So, you know, you're right. I am intimately familiar with a lot of the policy around this. And, you know, I would hope if elected that you and I could continue that relationship of making sure we're talking often. You know, Martha's been a longtime mentor of mine, and a lot of her positions are ones that, you know, I hope to carry on. But in terms of Coakley, you know, I think at the time it was raised to us that the issue was new, and so we were learning about what would make sense from a policy perspective. And again, to kind of go back to the data, you know, at the time, New Hampshire was one of the states that had a state level that was different from the federal level, or you know, and it also was sort of confronting, you know, 200 landfills across the state that obviously were going to need some form of remediation. So from my perspective, how I approached that was to understand the science. You know, I asked a lot of questions. I did a lot of reading. I spoke to folks at New Hampshire DES to make sure that I was getting the facts around it and understanding what PFAS is and how it travels. And I also think that understanding the capital decisions around what our policies would require municipalities is incredibly important, because we want to make sure we're putting in place requirements that are realistic and that will allow us to all work together towards what is a shared goal of making sure that everybody's safe and has safe drinking water, that our children feel safe, that our parents feel, as policymakers, we are absolutely protecting them. And so, you know, the issue, I don't know if you felt this way at the state level, it came up very quickly. And I think it was something that a lot of us really needed to get smart on quickly, but, you know, I'm sure did. And so I'm thankful that that issue got raised and that we were aware of it. And I'm also thankful that we took action in New Hampshire to make sure that we're bringing that level down, and that we're also pursuing the funds that we can to make sure that we have resources to clean up our water, because I do, I think it's a hugely important goal, and I would never discount the importance of us having trust in our water and in our resources. I also just want to make sure we as policymakers are helping implement solutions that the municipalities can live up to, and that we're balancing, all the needs sort of together as policymakers, and not necessarily just, diving headfirst into one or the other. So,
yeah, and especially in Portsmouth with the new wastewater facility, you guys are on the leading edge from the state's perspective. It's pretty exciting. I mean, how often do you get to talk about wastewater on a Zoom call? So
I have to tell you, we dealt with a lot of issues in my 4 years on council, but I had been in office for about 8 weeks when we had to make a $75 million bond vote on the wastewater treatment plant. So before that, we got to spend 4 hours touring wastewater treatment plants in the rain in January. So not only do I get to talk about them on Zoom calls, but yeah, it's another example of something where, you just never know as an elected official. You're always learning, and I think it's really important to be able to get up to speed, understand the science, as I'm sure you always feel like you're doing, or maybe you just know a tremendous amount, but it's to be able to digest that and to make sense of it and make sure that the policy that comes out of that is coherent and kind of matches our long-term goals.
Definitely. So what do you hope to get from being in the Senate? Obviously, there's always, you want to obviously help the people of your district, and I get that part, but what do you want to get out of it? What is it? Because we always, I'm not going to say we're all selfish, but like there's always, you're doing something because you don't get paid. You're doing something out of the goodness of your heart.
Sure.
But for why? And I mean, I'm probably just as much to say as you, like, oh, it's our civic duty and everybody should do it and it's great. But is there something else that like is driving you to do this?
Yeah. Yes and no. I think not to, sort of go back to this line, but I am really motivated by duty. But I do also think it's, for me, it's really important to see change on these issues. And so I got involved in housing because I felt like, when I left for college, and well, I didn't even leave for college, I was at Dartmouth, but, when I left after that, and then came back to the state a number of years later, we were still talking about attracting and retaining young professionals, and it was, I wasn't hearing any solutions. I attended all the forums, I went to all the talks, and it felt to me like we were saying similar things over and over again. And that's fine. It's important to talk about the problem, but I felt personally motivated to try and drive a solution there. And I especially felt motivated, for example, when Portsmouth was sort of having this conversation about, having its outdoor arts festival and, kind of development downtown. And I thought, it's really important to have places in this state where young people feel comfortable and where there's sort of a nightlife for them and they can have other people their age. And I think if we lose, some of those places, then we will have been talking and talking while we lost these sort of like important assets, to our state and our community. So that was why I ran for city council, was very much just to make sure that we addressed the problem before it was too late. And so, I feel similarly motivated in New Hampshire. I think this is an incredibly unique year in our democracy, and so what I would hope to get out of it is that, the time that I spent, if I were to be elected, was impactful, and that we were able to drive solutions on things like clean water, like healthcare for those who have lost it during this time, like small businesses that survived, and, being able to point to results from that, to a conversion to green energy in the next couple of years. I think I understand there's political history on all of those issues, and it's complicated, and so I don't view any of that as easy, but I do think with enough motivation and conversation, you can at least make incremental change. And I think it's important to do that. So.
That's awesome. What do you think your differences are from not only Senator Fuller Clark, but from, or maybe your similarities? How about we do that? Similarities and differences from our current senator to the people you're running against. What stands out? What makes you different and special, and why we all have to vote for you?
Yeah, sure. Well, you should all vote for me because I'm the nicest person. No, I think that it's important to make sure we're earning those votes. But one of the things I think that does at least distinguish me is, being able to have the perspective that me and my wife have as, sort of a slightly different perspective on how, democratic principles protect our way of life and protect our family. And I think, for me, the opportunity to be involved in the New Hampshire state government at this level it's important, and it's something that I, have worked around and near my whole life, and would really, for me, kind of be a culmination of a series of, being someone who attended hearings, being someone who took notes on hearings, like tried to drive legislation. I mean, I was involved last fall in drafting 2 large housing bills. I've just kind of, I was involved in organizing like fact sheets around a state employees pension credit, like during my time right after Peace Corps. It's been something where I have been around it and have considered it important my whole life. And so for me, the opportunity to come from sort of this small business where, like I was helping my single mom survive, running this restaurant, to be able to kind of be involved in these decisions is something that I would be honored to do. And I think to additionally be able to do that with the perspective that, that having my wife gives me, in terms of just, being able to be aware of how the rule of law protects us and how the laws and the policies really do matter to us on a very personal level. I think, again, it would kind of be an honor to be there, and I think it would be exciting for the state. So.
Cool. One last thing, or I guess there's 2 questions left for me. What do you want to tell the Lee Dems that I haven't already asked you, or you haven't already responded?
Sure. Not a lot. We've covered a lot of the subjects, and I don't know how you feel. I mean, it's often interesting campaigning because you're talking about yourself the whole time. And, what's interesting to me is making sure that we kind of see these policy changes. But I guess I would just say that I'd love to meet anyone individually. I'd be more than happy to talk about this stuff for a much longer time. I feel like I haven't gotten to ask you any questions, which I know was not the point of this particular session, but
when we turn off, we'll have a conversation. No worries. The Lee Dems already know me.
But I just my cell phone number, my email are public. I'd love to hear from anyone and get to know them and hear what they have to say about everything. So.
Well, so then this ties into it. What can the Lee Dems do to help you?
Yeah, they can help me understand their experience so far in the pandemic. I think that it's really important, if we're going to craft policy solutions in this time, that we know how, every resident here has been affected to the extent we can. So I think, again, understanding how some of the farms have dealt with the pandemic, some of the other small businesses, how folks in hospitality and self-employed are faring. Hearing those experiences, I think, is critically important to understanding what solutions we need. And while I've heard some of that over here, they're very different issues where you are, and I want to make sure that all of those voices are represented in what I'm talking about. So I would love to come out and visit anybody outdoors, or just spend some time in Lee with some new faces.
Awesome. Cool. Well, I think with that, I will end the recording, and I will send this out to the Lee Dems. We have a YouTube page that has all of our monthly recordings, so this will live on that, and we'll post it on our social media, which, now that I say that, is really only Facebook, but we'll do that. And I send the link out. So when I send the link out, I'll CC you, and I'll also put your contact info in the body of the email. if any of the group should want to reach out, they'll know how to.
Okay, that sounds great.
All right. So I'm going to end the recording.